Question 3 is an algebra question which wants you to work with the formulas. And sometimes on the exam, like for example, question 1, they'll put this on the non-calculator part of your exam, and they'll say that you have to be able to solve it algebraically. Okay? Algebraically means you need to show all your work. You can't guess and check. You can't use shortcuts like saying, hey, that 2 means 2 spaces, and it has to equal 56. Can you think of what number has to be here and what has to be 1 less to make that work? 8 and 7. Perfect. You just solved the question, and you would get 1 out of 3 because you didn't do it algebraically. But it's nice to be able to have a shortcut to check your answer, right? I guess pretty quick. If I knew this meant 2 spaces, and I knew that they have to be consecutive numbers, starting with the big one, going down by 1, it has to be 8 and 7. Algebraically, though, you would have to go to your formula, and your formula would say NP2, because we have this. This is what our formula sheet says. NPR is n factorial over n minus r factorial. So NP2 would be n factorial over n minus 2 factorial, and that's equal to 56. And the algebra with factorials is you have to decide which one's bigger. Which is bigger, n or n minus 2? N is bigger, right? If you're unsure, put in a number. Like if you put n as 10, the top would be 10, the bottom would be 8. Obviously, the top is bigger. So use your definition. What does a factorial mean? It means we start with that number. Then we multiply by 1 less. Then we multiply by 1 less, and we keep going down until we get to the one on the bottom and say, hey, I'm going to stop there and say, that one keeps going. Because I have that also on the bottom, and those will simplify. And now the whole idea of algebraically with factorials, you want to expand the bigger one so that your factorials can go away. Once they've gone away, now what are we left with? We are left with a quadratic equation. N times n minus 1 would give me n squared minus n equals 56. How do I solve quadratic equations? I make one side equal to 0. And either factor, use a quadratic formula. This one factors nicely. They'll always factor nicely because the only thing that works are whole numbers. So this factors nicely to n minus 8, n plus 7. So you get 2 possibilities. N can be 8, and n can be negative 7. But you're never allowed to do factorials of negative numbers. So we would have to put an x through this one. So you get 1 mark for the n equals 8. You get 1 mark for expanding your factorials. You get 1 mark for canceling out the minus 7. So if you use the shortcut and just get 2 spaces, you get 1 out of 3, because the question's going to say you need to solve for it algebraically. Yes? But not all of them they're going to ask you to solve. Like some of your homework questions, they're not going to say algebraically. And some of them you can't really do nicely algebraically. The spaces is way better. So the second example was 5p3, no, 5pr, sorry, is equal to 20. Right? And remember that in the shortcut, this is how many spaces you have, and this is the number you start with. So this is one in particular that I would not do algebraically. So you have to look, it'll be very specific on the exam. They'll say algebraically. If they don't, I'd say use a shortcut. Okay? All right. So the shortcut would say, well, it could be 1 space. Is 1 space enough to equal 20? No. So add another space. Is that enough to equal 20? Yes. R equals 2. That's how easy it is. It took 2 spaces to get to 20. Algebraically, you would have 5 factorial over 5 minus r factorial, okay, which is confusing to do algebraic, equals 20. Because you would know that the bottom has to be smaller than the top, okay? So you would start expanding the top until you got to 20. And still, it's not really algebraic. You're kind of still doing the same sort of thing that the r has to be 2 by expanding it. But it's not really algebraic that way. No, if it's solving for r, it probably won't be an algebraic one. And if it is an algebraic one, almost always it's NP2, so you get a quadratic equation. Sometimes it's an NP3, then you get a cubic equation, then you'd have to use your factor theorem, synthetic division, to factor it from chapter 1. That could happen, but usually in those ones, sort of the shortcut is probably like, well, if you know it's a whole number, and you know it can't be negative, we should probably just use shortcut. So, all right, circle question 10.